Hello, good morning. Oh, actually, it's good afternoon, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself?
Of course, yes. So my name's Diane Silverthorne, and in fact, I started life in public relations and marketing. I ran my own PR company for many years. I started up as an academic some time ago when I did an art history degree. And then I went on to do a master's and eventually a PhD, and now of course I'm running the second year of the cultural studies course here at Central St Martin's.
Great, thank you so much, Diane.
Pleasure.
Could you please give me some tips on how to carry out a research, like in a professional, good way?
Okay, so there are lots of different kinds of research, and so the first and the aim of the research has to be really clear from the outset. So you might be doing research into a business or a company in order to develop a business communication strategy for them. You might be looking at competitors, you might be doing all sorts of things. But if we're talking or looking at consumer markets, that's another kind of research. What we're really specifically looking at is research in the academic field, is that right?
Yeah.
So the first starting point, if we try and break it down really simply, is to develop the topic and also to be clear about your research question or questions. So for example, if we set you an essay subject to write about, we call the title of the essay question. So even though the title of the essay is not necessarily phrased as a question with a question mark after it, nevertheless the starting point is this title, if you like, of your research. And if you're doing research into a particular topic or topics, constructing your questions or research questions is one of the most important starting point. So, for example, I could write a very nice essay on black and white cats, but the research that I need to do for an essay on black and white cats is so wide that I would never stop reading, I would never know when to stop. If my essay question is, in what ways do black and white cats impact the emotions of their owners, ? I'm starting to construct a narrower field of study and research, which can then help give me a sense of what I then need to go off and read and look at. So that's the starting point.
Great. And let's imagine that I have I figure out my research question. Questions. Do you have any tips on how, what sources could I use to conduct my research?
Well, there are a whole range of resources. When I did my degree, I started my first degree 20-something years ago. The internet had only really just started to get going. And when I was in college, we were given various resources and texts and reading that was part of the course, and that's where we always started our research, from the kind of texts and areas of information that were part of the course. Now everything is very, very much broader and wider because we have the whole of the internet and goodness only knows what else in order to research our subject. If we're trying to produce a piece of a piece of serious research, and we're trying to write a serious piece of writing that is credible and authoritative, then the first thing you really need to do is to think about doing a literature review. So the internet can be a useful source to start with, but ultimately you need to think about the topic, focus down your essay question, and then start with university library resources, for example. I have to admit that occasionally, even when I've been researching material for an article in what we call a peer-reviewed journal, where my chapter will then go to 2 experts who will interrogate it. I do sometimes go onto the internet to start the search going. But the kind of areas that I'll look at on the internet to think about a cultural subject, for example, will be, for example, authoritative museums and their archives and their internet resources and information on their archives. That is an entirely legitimate way of starting up your research, and indeed it's entirely acceptable, for example, to quote directly, as long as you refer to it, from resources like that. But the starting point has to be the latest reading that's been published on your subject, articles which are usually more recent research that have been already published on your subject. You asked the question also about the difference between primary and secondary research. So secondary writing on a particular subject might be, for example, a contemporary writer who has written an assessment of Freud's essay, Towards the Pleasure Principle. That's the secondary reading of an original piece of research or writing. Primary research, which is the Freud article. So you might be doing an interrogation of Freud's ideas. Your starting point, for example, would be Freud's original text, and then you would be looking at secondary sources, scholarship on the writings of Freud, to then look at various different interpretations of that piece.
And is it worth to talk sometimes to academics or to people who already wrote something on this subject, or what do you think?
It so much depends on what might be. There are all sorts of materials that are useful depending on whether you're researching something in the contemporary space, depending on whether you're researching something where everybody is already dead, artists, writers, whatever. I'm an art historian, so up until the time that I came to St Martin's, a lot of what I wrote about artists and even theories of writers that were no longer present. It just hugely depends on. In some ways, it's easier dealing with the material that authoritative sources and your original artist or your original subject produced than actually going to talk to them personally. However, if you're trying to do attitudinal research to something, or you're trying to get hold of materials that haven't been properly covered, particularly in this still very Western-centric world that we live in, then going to see contemporary writers whose published work doesn't necessarily fall into any of these rather obvious areas might be very useful, and particularly if you're doing research in somewhere like where is it you say you were going? Ghana, exactly. We know, much to our disappointment really in many ways, that most British libraries, research libraries, reference libraries, like the British Library for example, even are still not as well resourced as they should be on writings that may have been done in the original language in somewhere like Ghana. So in that case, if you wanted to try and find someone expert on your subject there, go and find them and go and talk to them. I'll just give you an example, which is not about Ghana, of course, but when I was doing my PhD, I wrote my PhD on turn of the century Vienna. Admittedly, I was then doing a PhD, but I was working on a figure who hadn't been very well covered in the literature, but there were one or two academics who had worked on him, this particular figure, who were still active in their university positions. And when you're doing a sort of 100,000 word written PhD on a particular figure, you want to get some idea of how these academics approached the subject matter and what they thought about the particular subject, which may not be in their book. So I did actually make appointments to go and see one or two academics who I thought could be helpful, and it was very useful for context and the kind of material that you can't get out of the writing.
Okay, great. I think that's it. Thank you so much, Diane.
That's a pleasure.
It was really helpful.
Please come and tell me about your project
Yeah.
and tell me how it's getting on, and if I can be of further help, I will.